Tammy and Mimi. It's a bit of a mouthful, growing up global. Try saying that 10 times fast. Raw sewage. The stench hit me like a punch in the nose. I switched to breathing through my mouth and walked on through the Caracas slum to the grimy building up ahead, El Retén de Katia. It was arguably the worst jail in Latin America at that time. I was on assignment to cover Venezuela's notorious prison system for a human rights magazine in London, and visiting this jail was an essential part of the story. It had actually been sort of a circuitous route to get there. I had applied for an official visit as a journalist to the Ministry of Prisons, but they had turned me down, saying they couldn't guarantee my safety. That only made me more determined to get in, so I reached out to my journalist network, and a friend put me in touch with a Filipina nun who visited the jail on a regular basis. Sister Concepcion agreed to be my escort, but there was a catch. "You'll have to pose as a nun," she said. I paused because it was against journalist ethics to misrepresent oneself. But it seemed it was the only way I was going to get into that jail. "Do I have to wear a habit?" I asked. She said, "No, I just wear jeans and a t-shirt." So that was a huge relief. And then the irony of a nun telling me to lie hit me, and I smiled. Then she said, "But there's another catch." And she cleared her throat. I waited. "All women visitors entering the jail have to undergo a vaginal search." I swallowed hard. I had to get into that jail if I was going to expose egregious human rights violations. But this was asking a lot. But I looked at this young nun with a doll-like face and a kind smile, and I figured, well, if she could do it, so could I. The following Saturday, Sister Concepcion and I joined the women's visitors line at the jail. The line snaked into a guard's hut where this search was going to take place. I was already sweating. It was mid-morning, but the tropical sun was beating down, and I was also sweating at the prospect of what lay ahead. Sister Concepcion entered the hut, and then it was my turn. My stomach was churning. But I proceeded inside where a female officer was waiting with a rubber-gloved hand. She told me to unzip my jeans and lie down on a table, which I did, and then I, steeling myself, stared at the ceiling, and all she did was simply pat my abdomen and told me to zip up. And I sat up and said, "That's it?" And she said, "Yes, we just changed the policy this week because we had so many complaints about it." So, yes. Dazed by this incredible stroke of luck, I rejoined Sister Concepcion on the other side of the hut, and we walked down a corridor into the main building, past an office full of guards gossiping and smoking, and got into the main building, and I scanned the place, and there were inmates and visitors everywhere, but no guards. And then I understood why the officials couldn't guarantee my safety, because the prisoners ran the jail. Our first stop was the infirmary. Expecting a sort of hospital ward setup, I was shocked when we entered a sunny courtyard and saw sick men sort of lolling about on the concrete ground. No chairs, beds, tables, nothing. Sister Concepcion signaled an emaciated young man who was lying on the ground and said he whispered to me that he was dying of an AIDS-related illness. So crouching down, I asked him what treatment he received. "A glass of milk every day," he said. My heart wrenched for this young man who was simply abandoned to his fate. Then we made our way to the cafeteria, where the concrete tables were coated with a disgusting, thick layer of black grease. Inmates gathered around us, and we started talking to them. Thankfully, no one suggested we sit at those filthy tables. I asked about their living conditions, and one inmate said to me, "Oh, you should see this broken pipe in the basement." So I said, "Sure." So I left Sister Concepcion and I followed him downstairs to this dimly lit, concrete, empty area where, sure enough, there was this huge broken pipe just pouring, gushing out black wastewater just onto the floor. And then as we're chatting, he draws out a long, from the back of his pants, about a 2-foot length piece of metal sharpened to a point at the end. And he said, "This is mi chuzo," he said with a lot of pride. It was his homemade weapon that he'd crafted out of a bed leg. And I thought, wow, I really struck up a good rapport with this guy for him to show me this thing. Then a razor blade of fear sliced through me, and I thought, what the hell am I doing? I'm alone with this hardened convict in this empty basement. If I screamed, no one would hear me, and even if they did, it was highly doubtful anyone was going to come to my rescue. So I remained calm, and I just said, "Hey, that's very impressive," and then I calmly suggested we go back upstairs and rejoin Sister Concepcion, and luckily he agreed. Back on the main floor, Sister Concepcion wanted to show me the cell box, so we left these inmates and went upstairs, and I noticed there were buckets everywhere, and I asked what they were for, and one prisoner told me, "That's our water supply." And I asked further, and apparently there were no faucets. There were one faucet per floor, no sinks or showers. That was their water supply. An inmate sitting nearby was observing this conversation, and he leaned forward, and he narrowing his eyes, and he said, "You're asking a lot of questions. You wouldn't be a periodista, a journalist." My heart crashed against my rib cage. My cover was blown. But I remained calm, and I said, "I'm just concerned about prisoner welfare." He eyed me for a moment longer, then he sat back, seemed to buy the story, and I smiled at him. Not long after that, I told Sister Concepcion, "I think I've had enough for the day." So we left. Without a doubt, that visit to that jail was the edgiest assignment I've ever had in my 3 decades plus as a journalist. But I loved it. I loved the adrenaline rush of fear, of unpredictability, as well as exposing injustice through my writing. I spent a decade as a foreign correspondent in Latin America, writing for Time, Business Week, the New York Times, Miami Herald, to name a few. I covered all kinds of stories in over a dozen countries. I covered a coup attempt in Venezuela, peace talks with guerrillas in Colombia, the forensic dig of a mass grave in Guatemala. Foreign reporting was definitely the highlight of my career. Now, it's easy to think that these experiences would make for interesting cocktail party conversation, or impress the hell out of a date, or maybe make a great prize-winning novel material. But actually, I've found they're not. These experiences are so far out of the norm that most people simply cannot relate to them. What's thrilling and fascinating to me is scary and unimaginable to most. So people don't have a neat category to put me in. And I see it in their glazed looks, or their abrupt switch in conversation to safer topics like the latest cruise they went on, or comments like, "Well, why did you want to go to a place like Guatemala anyway?" Not fitting in is a challenge I've had to deal with my whole life. I am what is known as a third culture kid, or TCK. TCKs are expatriates who grow up internationally because of a parent's job. My mother, a British nurse, and my father was a mining executive from New Zealand. They met in northern Rhodesia, which was now called Zambia. Shortly before Mom was due to give birth to me, my dad whisked her off to New Zealand, where I was born, and a few months later, we were on the move. Over the first dozen years of my life, we lived in Fiji, England, Sweden, Nigeria, New Zealand, then Australia. When I was 13, we moved from Sydney to New Jersey. We'd watched tons of old American TV shows in Sydney, and I even knew that Don Drysdale was a famous baseball player thanks to the Brady Bunch. But we suffered tremendous culture shock despite all that. Academically, I was way ahead, so I was put in 9th grade, but I was way behind in American teenagerdom. I never owned a pair of Levi's. I didn't know what a shopping mall was. No one understood my Aussie accent or words I used. Teachers marked my British spellings as mistakes. They couldn't read the style of cursive handwriting I'd been taught. Everything about me was wrong. So to fit in, to belong, I had to cast off the very essence of me. I never talked about where I came from, places I'd been, things I'd seen. After my accent faded in a year or so, no one suspected that I was different. Mission accomplished. 6 years later, however, I went back to Australia to visit family and friends. To my surprise, I discovered I no longer fit in there. Australians saw me as American. I saw myself as Australian, and I had the passport to prove it. So where was my place in the world? How did I fit in? I decided I had to return to the United States, cut off the past, and embrace Americanness. I became a US citizen. But in my late 20s, my childhood that had addicted me to novelty and adventure came roaring back. I quit my job at a New Jersey newspaper and I went traveling. And over the next 10 years, I lived and worked in Spain, Guatemala, and Venezuela. That was perhaps the closest I've come to feeling at home because I belonged to a group, expats. Still, I wasn't like most expats. They were all from somewhere. New Jersey, I'd say, when asked where I was from, but I didn't feel from there. And each time I was asked that question, it underscored that I really wasn't from anywhere. So in my 30s, I began to resent my parents for hauling me around the world, for not giving me a real home. Ultimately, all that angst got me was a big chip on my shoulder. So I decided I had to make my home wherever I was. So when I moved back to the United States to enroll my son in kindergarten, once again, I hid myself. After all, I thought identity, home, belonging, they're intangible things. They really don't matter, do they? And this dilemma of identity lurked in my background for years until last year, a friend of mine who I'd related a few of my foreign adventures to recommended me as the speaker at a college fundraising event, scholarship fundraising event. And they wanted me to speak about my career. So I did. For over 30 minutes, I spoke about my foreign reporting career and my childhood. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. Afterward, people came up to me and said, "You should write a memoir. Your life could be a movie." And for the first time, I felt that my life experience was actually worthy. That validation led me to try something new, acceptance of my difference. So I began to talk more about my life, to use words and pronunciations I've always felt more comfortable with, like tomato, rubbish, that I only ever used with my family, but not outside. I have come to realize since then that most people who don't have reference points for experiences much beyond their own, nor do they know how to show interest beyond polite inquiries like, "So what do you do?" Their reaction to my story has nothing to do with me. It's about them and the comfortable worlds they have built for themselves. I've just built a less comfortable world. And in doing so, I've joined a different group, one that's harder to find because we're outsiders. Still, it's been a struggle to change my self-narrative. We weave beliefs about ourselves as protective swaddling in our early lives. But these beliefs can become straitjackets in adulthood. We are so tightly bound in them that they're hard to cast off. I still get that hiccup of shyness when asked where I'm from. I'm still self-conscious about my accent and change it to whatever audience I'm talking to. But I've concluded that I'm like an octagon in a round hole. I fit the space, but not neatly. And you know what? It's okay. That's okay to not fit in, to not belong. It's okay to be different, to be who I am. Thank you.